Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Handing the Shame Back. This is a YouTube channel dedicated 100% to adult survivors of child sexual abuse in New Zealand and out across the world. To the new subscribers to the channel, thank you so much, and I hope that you stay watching and listening and feeling informed, and that you're not alone, because that's one of the hallmarks of child sexual abuse, is we often feel alone. So you're not. There's many of us out there. Before I introduce our next guest to you, I'd like to actually give a trigger warning, and it's simply this: if for any reason you start to feel quite triggered watching, please stop watching. Go to the show notes below and you'll be directed to some resource and help. So in the meantime, fabulous survivors, I've got a wonderful guest, and I'm very humbled to introduce Sarah Gallardo to you.
Gallardo.
Apologies. So let me talk to you a bit about Sarah before she even speaks. So in 2015, she is or became the executive director and founder of Sarahspeaksup. And this is a non-profit organisation promoting domestic violence awareness and resource for women, men and children. And I'm just so blown away by that. I'm just so impressed by that. Secondly, she also is an author. In 2017, she wrote Hiding in Plain Sight. That's well worth a read, guys. If you haven't seen that, go and have a look at that. She also, because there's always more with fabulous people like Sarah, she's also the founder of Veterans for Victims program, where she connects survivors of domestic violence to military veterans who support them. And one of the ways they do that, team, is to perhaps go to court with them or be alongside them. So naturally, she's a survivor as well of childhood sexual abuse, and we're going to launch in. Guess what, Sarah? You're allowed to speak now. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here today, Gloria. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. So look, there's many things, and there's so much that you and I can dive into, I guess, for us and for the benefit of people who are just coming forward and feeling into their own trauma around this. Are you able to share with us a little, or as much as you're okay to, about your child sexual abuse? Kind of what age you were, who may have been involved, any of that would be really helpful.
Yes. So this is not something that I speak about publicly very frequently. Often, I'm most often speaking about domestic violence. And I think it's, before I begin to answer those questions, for anyone out there who's watching and listening, I just want to validate that your experience is uniquely yours. Just because you experienced child sexual abuse doesn't mean you are going to find yourself in an abusive relationship in the future, and vice versa. Just because whether you haven't experienced child sexual abuse and find yourself in a domestic violence situation. So I don't want any of this to invalidate other people's experiences. But for me, as far as I can remember, the abuse started around the age of 8 years old for me. And that was with my biological father. And in my memory, I remember a certain amount of what we now know as grooming. Falling asleep in bed with me at nighttime, over the clothes touching, me sitting on his lap and rubbing happening. As a child, I had no idea what those things were. You know, we don't have that understanding at that age. And so what I find is one of the many cruelties here is that I know what happened to me is that it shifted. It actually shaped, it sort of deformed the way that I understood safe touch, boundaries. Um, my body is my choice of what happens to it. All those things were very convoluted and confusing. That being said, the abuse changed over time and became more less of the petting and sleeping together and more of the physical touching, invasive touch, and then escalated to rape. This also included tying up and some of those more, very much more adult, sort of into the kink type world. And again, as a child, I had nowhere to put that in my mind. I didn't know how to process it. And in a way, I found myself assuming that all my childhood friends were experiencing that at home. And that's sort of how I was able to rationalize, this isn't so awful. This is just what happens. This is what everyone is going through. But I never felt comfortable enough to ask my friends because I still felt this unspoken, again, I love the name handing the shame back because there's so much shame around this. And, we're taking on shame for things that weren't our fault. So, that's kind of how it started. And then it escalated for over the years until the age of 13, when I eventually began to menstruate.
Okay. And well, full respect and love coming your way.
Thank you. Thank you.
That was tough.
Yeah, I remember too. I remember my very first gynecology appointment, and I remember my father actually insisting on going with me. So my mother was there. My parents were going through a divorce at the time, actually, and interestingly, and I guess more tragically, I had been manipulated by my father against my mother, who he had also abused. And she began to drink to excess to the point where she considers herself an alcoholic. And I understand that now as an adult looking back, being able to have compassion for my mother, who I now understand had been abused herself. But at the time, as a 13-year-old girl, when I really needed my mother, it was such a vulnerable time. And of course, my father took advantage of that scenario, manipulated me against my mother. So between the ages of 13 and 16, by choice, I say by choice, but because my anger towards her was so fueled by my father, I didn't see or speak to my mother for those 3 years. And so those are absolutely imperative years where I think a growing girl needs her mom, and that was sort of stolen from both of us those years. And so during my parents' divorce, I actually, again, by choice, went with my father instead of my mother. And now I understand it's akin to a Stockholm syndrome type mentality, which again, he manipulated me into doing and fostered completely because number one, it looked good in court that his teenage daughter preferred to live with him. And number two, if his teenage daughter began to remember what had happened, I would be under his roof, no one else's. Therefore, he could control that narrative.
I think it's fascinating what you're saying, Sarah, and it just takes me back to an initial comment you made about grooming. His grooming was on point. It worked so well that you were groomed and manipulated into living with him. And then it can easily be turned back on you as though that was your choice.
Exactly.
Very clever, very clever. You talk about the gynecological appointment he went to with you, or he made sure he was in the room. How old were you when that took place?
I was, 13, 14 years old. I don't remember the exact date.
Yeah.
But I do actually, and interestingly, I was receiving an award later that day, the Daughters of the American Republic or something to that effect. And there's a newspaper clipping, and I remember being at the GYN appointment before that with both my parents, who were completely hated each other. But again, he insisted on being there. And then from then, we went to this award where they were both present. It was one of the most uncomfortable experiences. It was to be recognized is supposed to feel, you're supposed to be excited and honored, and it was just, I was feeling so icky the whole time.
And look, well, there's so many things you have raised, Sarah, and well done. But there's well done. There's so many hallmarks of abuse that you have kind of raised and experienced and mentioned. And I guess, one of them was thinking or feeling it was normal, and the shame keeping you quiet. So you kind of assume your friends were going through it, but there was just something that kept you quiet. And my question is, because there is one, we are getting there, is with your dad grooming you from a young age, clearly, up until you had kind of felt you could find your voice around this, felt safe enough to actually. Did he coerce you, or how did he manage to keep you quiet? Because there's a whole range of behaviours these abusers use, and I just wonder what he used to keep you quiet and keep the secret.
He was extremely clever in this way, and for a long time I tried not to think it was intentional, but now I realize that it all was very calculated. For some reason, I wanted to believe that almost that he didn't realize, but again, this, call a spade, and you have to look at it for what it is. This person knew what he was doing. He was extremely lenient with me. So if you imagine a 13-year-old turning 14, now 15, 16, those years are when we begin to blossom. Teenagers start to feel out boundaries. Can we push the boundaries? I'm thinking of, what is my identity, learning, having boyfriends or girlfriends, depending, and all those sort of new experiences. And he was extremely lenient with me. And I think that was part of his tactic, was give the kid what she wants. Give her, want to go out, go ahead. I'm not gonna, come after you. I'm almost very, very allowing, so that we weren't butting heads. He wasn't a helicopter parent. Quite the opposite. In fact, there were nights I'd come home, he'd just be sleeping. He wouldn't wait up, wouldn't check on anything, So for me, that was, I think, sort of his tactic. And then now what I end up realizing was, when I went away to college for that first year. So I went through high school, and it was very much that lenience. I got into Berklee College of Music, which in the US is an extremely well-known music school. And I was thrilled. So my dreams coming true, and being in a different place, living in a separate environment, that's when the memories begin to come back to me. And now I know that's a fairly common thing, but at the time I had no clue that's what was going to happen. So here's now in order to survive in my high school years, I was captain of the diving team. I did any vocal performance, all state, region, Northern regionals, choirs, high school newspaper editor, just as active as possible so I could be in school as much as I could, because it was safe there. Going home, coming home when he was sleeping, at least that was safe. And so all of a sudden, me in college, my grades start slipping because I began to remember. So they're like, what's going on with our straight A student? She's slipping. My father convinced my family that I was going crazy, and whatever narrative he passed on them, and my family didn't know any better, believed him. And I was disowned by my family in 1999. I was left in Boston with no one to pick me up, just a dorm room full of things that I own, and you can't stay here situation, who comes to get you. So listening, go ahead.
No, I just said, oh, Sarah.
Oh, well, and so, you think, and I did think I was almost this like leper in a way, that I felt for the longest time like I was the family trash can. I was the black sheep. I was the discardable one. I was the one who, to the best of my ability, kept my two younger sisters safe, so the same thing didn't happen to them. Yet I knew I was kind of damaged goods. And so I was picked up by my, the guy that I dated over my summer job, brought back home to Connecticut, and I waitressed, and my heart was broken.
Yeah. And I guess when you think about all of that, it's what we call Darvoed. So you were denied your truth. You were attacked through your credibility or your state of mind or your black sheepness. And we'll talk about black sheep in a minute. The order was then reversed. So you then became the offender and the offender became the victim. Aren't they clever? So your your dad, your abuser, became a Class A manipulator and everybody believed him. So,
yes,
you know, just a little note on Black Sheep, because for our wonderful audience watching, there are those among you, and us included here today, who have been labelled Black Sheep. And I just want you wonderful survivors to know Black Sheep have special gifts and powers. We are here actually to share
yeah.
and to shine. So next time someone tells you you're a black sheep, say, yeah, I know, I'm so lucky. But Sarah, he managed to keep you quiet. He then managed to shut everybody else down around you. What happened as you became a little older? I know pre-show we talked a little bit about as you then got older and what things changed into. Are you comfortable to talk about what that may have looked like?
Yeah, yes. So what changed as I got older? So when I came home and was waitressing, I had my first suicide attempt in my 20s. I think many of us have those in our history. That's sort of par for the course. We are pushed to an emotional breaking point. I think more often than we care to realize ourselves, even. So I was medicated. I was highly medicated. It was during those years, the just early, just 2001, where at the time bipolar was overused. And actually, bipolar disorder has so many overlaps with complex PTSD symptoms, which is my actual diagnosis now. But at the time, for a span of 5 years, they tried every medication on me, you know, the antidepressant and mood stabilizing combination. I gained so much weight. I lost my hair. It was just a terrible, terrible time. And I could hardly function. I was basically a zombie. You know, cut to then meeting my now ex-husband. Very quickly on in our relationship, I became pregnant and I experienced reproductive abuse with him. So just very quickly, I wasn't allowed to take birth control. And I would try to hide it because I knew I didn't want to have a child with him. He would find it. He would beat me, rape me. I got pregnant twice, 2 miscarriages from the violence. And then my third pregnancy, I was able to see to term, and I gave birth to a healthy baby who is just my life. I love this child. And I will never forget the moment where I'm holding my baby and I think, if anybody ever hurts this child, I don't know what I'm going to do. And then I thought further, if this child witnesses me being beaten by their father, will I not be teaching them that this is acceptable? And so when I had my 6-month-old baby, that's when we left him. During that time, I began to remember what my father had done. And so I reconciled in myself that I had been abused as a child. However, I experienced financial abuse with my ex-husband. So I had a young baby, a cat, and 2 dogs with no money and no place to go. And that's when I apologized to my father for ever believing that he had abused me in order to have a safe place to come home to. And I didn't go to his house. I went to his mother and sister's house, which is my aunt and grandmother. But because he had that influence over the family, I had to reconcile with him in order for myself and my child to have a place to live. So I did. And I was able to push it all back for a long time. You know, living in this house, I was with my aunt and my grandma. My grandparents built that home in 1952. It was the only place that was safe throughout my whole life. This home, this beautiful house, and I was living there. You know, my aunt and my grandma, they took care of us. And, you know, my child was getting older, and sadly, my grandmother passed away. And then my aunt got cancer, and she beat cancer, but she passed away suddenly as a result of the medication. So one day, like that, everything changes. And the house we were living in, I was able to keep for myself and my child. But my father was the trustee of those accounts. And he began skimming money. And over time, I started to realize something was wrong because things were getting shut off. The electricity was one of them, you know, and to the point where, you know, I was working, single mom, no child support. That's when I started my organization. I wrote my book. My child is growing up beautifully, happily. And all the while, my father was trying to get that house out from under us. Really, that was a house he had grown up in, and he wanted to live in it. So he tried to have us evicted from our home. And I had to fight him for 1.5 years in probate court, and he would not yield. He would not yield. I finally won, and the time was too late. We found out that my home was in $20,000 worth of property tax debt, and it would be foreclosed upon if we didn't quick sell. I think losing the house was one of the biggest losses in my entire life, and my child's as well. But it's an example of how the abuse never ended. And even during court, he was saying, well, she's crazy. He said, I stole the money, that I took all of it. And I didn't even have access to those accounts, but it was the same dynamic from before, played out in a different arena with a different kind of loss, but still feeling that I was raped at the end of the day.
Well, the assaults just didn't stop, and the fact that you were able to find within you a way to challenge, I guess, for your beautiful child and yourself to have a home to stay in and be in. And something you raised, you know, full honour to you, Sarah. What incredibly difficult challenges. I so applaud you.
Thank you.
Yeah, for survivors watching this, you know, you can see Sarah, the story Sarah's sharing shows how she was left with no choice but to reconnect and re-engage and live again with her father. And of course, it's nothing she or any of you would want to do in your own lives, but we know with the beautiful big hearts we have as a survivor family that we do what we do because partly we're conditioned. And when you're groomed from a very young age, with respect, and it's just my opinion, Sarah, I'd be interested in yours, but you don't actually really have a choice. As an adult, it doesn't matter how old you are. You're instantly transported back in time to the child you were when all of this began. So Sarah wasn't necessarily an adult woman. She became the child again under her father's control. So Sarah, be interested in your thoughts around that. And also, was there, I'm just wondering, because this can happen as well, moving back in with your father, bless your courage for being able to do that, was there any sexual abuse at that point, or did he try to abuse you again?
So, just so I wasn't actually in the same house with him. Yeah. So it was his mother and sister.
Oh, their home.
I was in their home, but that was his childhood home.
Yeah.
He just lived in the next town. The next town over is the house in which he originally abused me as a child.
Okay.
Yeah, but however, this is a very interesting thing because and I think this speaks very much to the mind and how the mind tries to protect us in terms of disassociation, detachment, and in choosing to believe a narrative that won't cause us to be traumatized every minute of every day. And I think most often, I used to say I hate my brain because that's where all the trauma lives. But actually, I've come to love my brain because it worked really, really hard to navigate some insane obstacle course over time, and still for me to be even remotely okay is rather miraculous, I think.
Phenomenal.
I mean, good job, brain, right? Like, so, but one thing I do remember is, so having sort of allowed myself to believe this different narrative. So, sort of packing it back away, this truth that I had come to remember, packing it back away for survival, for us to survive. I remember I was in the house, my father had stopped by, and I was doing things around. I think it was yard work or something like that. And I came inside the house, and again, I'm very, very protective of my child, as you can imagine. I found him sleeping in my child's bed with them.
Sarah.
And Gloria, I first of all, I don't, there is part of me that will never forgive myself the fact that even happened. Second of all, I took my child to the doctor and I asked my child repeatedly, and they said that nothing had happened. What I know is that was how it started for me. So what gives me peace, or at least helps me feel okay, is that I caught that in the beginning, at the very start. That's one of the first things that would have happened. But I will never forget how it was like I saw red, I saw stars. I'm surprised I didn't pick this large man just up over my head, just like a Hulk type strength.
Yeah.
Because never again, never. And that that is what snapped me back once again to say, no, 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 this is the truth. You have to know this. You have to remember this. This isn't for you and this house anymore. This is for your child, who I was able to keep safe from their own biological father, and then had to keep safe from my biological father.
Well, look, I just want to say, you know, what a horrible situation for you to have been in, and for your beautiful child to have been in. And also for this, because sometimes as survivors, we struggle with self-love and self-forgiveness. No surprise there, would you agree? But
agreed.
But I just want to kind of share, in case you haven't quite been able to. Please forgive yourself. You are a star. You did your absolute best 100% of that time. There was no intent in you ever, Sarah, for anything to happen to your child. You forgive yourself. That man chose what he did. He was the manipulator of all time. He knew exactly when to be there and what to do. So please honour the beautiful survivor you are.
Thank you. Thank you. Interestingly, that's been one of the main concerns of mine, was my own two sisters and my child. I think about, it's almost like dyeing a fabric, and I did not want that dye to spread to any other garment. It was also, it felt very much like, I will absorb all of this because I already am colored by it, if you will, you know, to stick with the analogy. But it was so important to me to keep my sister safe when I was younger, and then as a mother to keep my child safe. Those were my major focuses, and they always have been. And now it's difficult, but it's also important. My sisters both married their high school sweethearts, both have beautiful homes and children, lovely families, very happy. I'm so proud and grateful of them. I mean, they're great people. My nieces and nephew, awesome. My brothers-in-law, good guys. I know. And for my own child, you know, to have been raised by a traumatized single mother with no child support, no financial backing, to now have earned a full financial scholarship to a private high school here in the US. I mean, my teenager is doing phenomenally well, and I'm just really happy and very proud. So if I ever need to feel validated, sometimes all it takes is for me to look at them.
It's amazing, and so honour you, Sarah. I so honour you. And, you know, you having to take on that responsibility, it's kind of like the parentified child, where your mum became an alcoholic and you kind of took over understanding and trying to look out for, but also it worked in your father's favour, so you couldn't actually be that child. And you know, part of me is screaming, what about you? Who looked out for you? And I guess you may have had some guiding light or some help around, unseen help potentially, but you're definitely here to to shine a light and to share your black sheepness with the world. We love black sheep. Come on, everyone.
Yeah.
We love black sheep. Who would the world be without us?
Exactly. We're the spice. I think we're the je ne sais quoi.
That's the one.
Yeah.
So I guess, you've got many things to be proud of, and it's, you've come through such a long and challenging and torturous journey. And as we're going into the last 5 minutes, I guess I wanted to ask you, what helped you survive this child sexual abuse? What has helped you as a survivor? Because I'm sure our listeners and people watching would love to know what helped Sarah get through.
Thank you for asking that question, because it's something that I actually talk to my own clients about an awful lot. And I have to say, I know the first answer is music for me, singing and that artistic expression, being able to voice, putting emotion. We talk a lot about the mind-body connection and how trauma can be stored in our bodies. So having movement is so important. And I think that vocally expressing what I was feeling, what I was experiencing was so important for me. If I had bottled it up, I cannot know how badly that could have gone. And then I think secondly would have been writing. For me, I've been writing poetry since the age of 13, which happens to be the age when the abuse, the sexual abuse anyway, stopped. And that was another form of expression. I think it's imperative for you to find whatever it is, move your body, get yourself active, become engaged in a community, get the words out of you, whether you say them, sing them, write them. If you hit a punching bag, if you go jogging, if you need to crochet, express yourself. Please let your truth live outside your body in whatever form that is.
I love that. Sarah. I think that's so important. What kind of tips would you give to survivors as well? I know you've talked about what helped you. Just thinking, any tips or techniques you would like to offer?
Oh yeah. So I found great success with EMDR therapy, which is rapid eye movement therapy. If anyone is unaware, EMDR is it changes the way that your mind processes the trauma you've experienced. Please Google it if you are interested. I hope that you have access to therapy. Therapy, of course, I highly recommend. And secondly, I find that grounding techniques are specifically important for trauma survivors. And this is a little quip. This is a funny thing about me. For me, I started this again at the age of 13, strange. I have tape with me all the time, everywhere I go. And the reason, now I started doing this when I was 13. I had never heard of grounding techniques in my life. Now they've got fidget spinners, they've got the clicky things, there's all different kinds. For me, I really like the way that the stickiness feels against each ridge of my fingerprint. And that helps my mind connect with what I feel in my hand, which gets me out of a triggered, heightened sort of spiraling place and more into a grounded body feeling sense. I had no idea that's what I was doing when I was 13 years old, but it's always the thing that stuck with me. So again, don't judge the things that work for you. Everybody in my life now knows that this is what I do. They know the reason. It's not a problem. But again, what works for you, don't judge it, embrace it.
That's awesome, Sarah. I love that. And I don't know if you know this, but tape and sticky tape in psychotherapeutic terms is symbolic of holding together or containing. So isn't that phenomenal?
Wow.
So
that is. I love that.
Helpful. Yeah, so well done. You knew something about you knew. Hey,
something, look, yeah.
Sarah, we need to close, but please don't go anywhere. And
of course,
for our beautiful audience, wow, what a powerful guest to have share her story with us. I feel very humbled, actually. And a couple of things that Sarah said, well, she said many, but the ones that I really feel moved by were that bipolar and complex post-traumatic stress disorder have many of the same symptoms or symptomology, and I think it's really important because as survivors we can get labelled. So there you go. It's possibly not a mental health issue, it's more that the trauma is still sitting. Secondly, move. Sarah suggested move, and I love that. Express however you can. There's so many ways. So look, until we meet again, wonderful survivor family, nothing but such respect and love to you. Keep being strong.